Deep beneath the shattered timbers of her family's historic barn lies a government research facility so classified that black SUVs surrounded Olivia Westbrook's property the morning after a devastating tornado exposed the underground chamber, offering her millions to forget what the splintered floorboards had revealed and the truth her grandfather died protecting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Olivia Westbrook never planned on becoming a farmer. After 12 years as a senior archivist at one of Washington, D.C.'s most prestigious historical preservation institutions, her life was defined by climate-controlled document rooms, meticulous preservation techniques, and academic conferences where she was becoming a rising star in the field of American agricultural history. At 36, she had just been shortlisted for the directorship of the National Agricultural Archives and purchased a renovated brownstone in Georgetown, a far cry from the rural Virginia farmland where she'd grown up. Westbrook Heritage Farm had been in her family since 1935, when her great-grandfather Thomas acquired the land after returning from documenting farming practices for the Farm Security Administration during the Great Depression. Unlike the industrial operations dominating modern agriculture, their modest 120 acres remained stubbornly rooted in heritage farming methods. Olivia's grandfather, Joseph Westbrook, had refused to convert to commercial monoculture, maintaining heirloom crop varieties, traditional livestock breeds, and seed-saving practices, despite industry pressure. "We're not just growing food, we're preserving history," Joseph would say, earning dismissive glances from neighbors with massive GPS-guided equipment and genetically modified crops. The Westbrook operation was an anomaly, historically authentic, but increasingly at odds with agricultural economics. Olivia had respected her grandfather's principles, but never shared his passion for hands-on farming. Their relationship had cooled after she chose document preservation over seed preservation, their conversations becoming infrequent and somewhat strained over the years. When the call came that her grandfather had suffered a fatal heart attack, while repairing the century-old barn's roof, Olivia was preparing a major exhibition on vanishing American farming traditions. She returned to Shenandoah Valley for the funeral, expecting to quickly arrange for the farm to be sold. The weathered farmhouse with its handmade quilts and worn wooden furniture felt like artifacts that belonged in her museum, not her life. What Olivia hadn't expected was her grandfather's unusual will. Joseph had left everything to his only granddaughter with one significant condition. Olivia must personally operate the farm for at least one full growing season before making any decisions about its future. If she sold before completing a harvest, 90% of the proceeds would go to the Heritage Seed Preservation Trust rather than to her. "Your grandfather wanted you to make an informed decision," explained Benjamin Harper, the attorney who had handled the Westbrook legal matters for decades. "He believed you wouldn't truly understand what you'd be giving up without experiencing a full cycle on the land. To him, this farm wasn't just property, it was living history." Olivia was initially frustrated at what felt like her grandfather controlling her from beyond the grave. The timing couldn't have been worse. Directorship track, new home, and a relationship with Marcus that was already complicated by her work schedule. But the financial reality was clear. The farm was worth $2.3 million, and Olivia wasn't willing to forfeit over $2 million out of principal. So Olivia reluctantly moved into the farmhouse, taking a 1-year leave of absence from her institution. Marcus supported her decision but refused to relocate, agreeing instead to weekend visits, an arrangement that put additional pressure on their already strained relationship. "It's just 1 year," Olivia assured him. "I'll hire someone to handle The actual farming while I supervise, then be back in D.C. next spring with a nice inheritance. That had been the plan, until Olivia discovered how difficult it was to find experienced heritage farm help in a county where agricore industries had absorbed nearly 80% of the local agricultural workforce. 4 weeks after moving in, Olivia was sorting through her grandfather's study, a book-lined room off the living room with oak filing cabinets and a desk covered in seed catalogues and handwritten crop journals. As she organized the papers, her fingers found a sealed envelope taped beneath the center drawer, her name written in her grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a brief letter. "Olivia, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've inherited a responsibility you never wanted. I apologize for this burden, but some legacies transcend our personal wishes. In the old barn beneath the northeast corner of the floorboards, you'll find a reinforced trapdoor leading to an underground room. The key is enclosed. One absolute rule has been followed by our family since your great-grandfather's time. This room is only to be opened during a structural failure of the barn itself. The contents would put our family at risk if discovered under any other circumstances. I know how this sounds, but I'm asking you to trust our family's judgment. What you'll find will change your understanding of this land and possibly your path forward. The Westbrook legacy is now in your hands. I've always been prouder of you than I managed to express." Grandpa Joe. Olivia stared at the letter, emotions washing over her. Her grandfather had never been open with his feelings, and the final lines struck her with unexpected force. Enclosed was an unusual brass key with complex teeth and what appeared to be electronic components embedded in the metal. Her first instinct was to dismiss these instructions as her grandfather's rural paranoia. The barn had been standing for over a century and had recently received structural reinforcements. The chances of a structural failure seemed remote, especially since the building had weathered countless storms without incident. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Yet curiosity led her to the barn that afternoon. The northeast corner was occupied by stacked hay bales and antique farm equipment. Moving these aside with considerable effort, Olivia examined the wooden floorboards and discovered what appeared to be ordinary planking was actually a carefully disguised access point. When she pried at a nearly invisible seam, a section lifted to reveal a modern high-security door embedded in concrete, completely incongruous with the historic barn above it. Using her grandfather's key, Olivia attempted to access it but found the lock wouldn't engage. Closer examination revealed a sophisticated mechanism with sensors, something she recognized from her work with sensitive historical archives. The room wasn't just hidden. It was specifically designed to open only when environmental sensors detected a significant structural compromise to the barn above. Olivia returned the key to her pocket, both frustrated and intrigued. Whatever her grandfather had considered important enough to hide beneath a 100-year-old barn would likely remain a mystery, as the chance of the sturdy structure failing seemed minimal. Walking back to the farmhouse, Olivia's phone rang. Catherine, her director, calling about her return timeline. "We need you back for the Farming Heritage Symposium," Catherine said after brief condolences. "The presentation deadline is September, and you're the only one who fully understands the exhibition framework." "September will be mid-harvest," Olivia replied, the farming terminology feeling foreign in her mouth. "I'm legally obligated to complete the growing season." The disappointment in Catherine's voice was evident. "We may need to reassign your directorship consideration if you can't commit. Major institutional projects can't pause while you're farming, Olivia." After hanging up, Olivia stood in the kitchen, feeling the weight of colliding worlds. In Washington, the career she'd spent 12 years building was slipping away. Here in Shenandoah Valley, fields needed immediate attention from someone with knowledge she didn't possess. And beneath the barn sat a mysterious room containing information that could only be accessed during a structural failure that might never come. As planting season approached, Olivia faced a decision that would shape not just the next year, but potentially her entire future. Commit to understanding the farm and its secrets, or go through the motions while planning her exit. What she couldn't know was that the contents of that underground room would soon connect these seemingly separate worlds, challenging everything she thought she knew about her family, their farm, and her own purpose. May brought unseasonably warm weather to the Shenandoah Valley, forcing Olivia into a crash course on heritage farming practices. Each morning she woke before dawn, a schedule her body rebelled against after years of academic hours, and spent time studying her grandfather's detailed agricultural journals. The worn, leather-bound books told a story very different from what Olivia had assumed about Westbrook Heritage Farm. Far from being an outdated operation stubbornly clinging to the past, her grandfather had been implementing sophisticated seed, banking and genetic preservation techniques decades before biodiversity became a scientific priority. The farm's modest size wasn't a limitation, but a deliberate choice to maintain the intensive documentation her grandfather had perfected. "Remarkable," Olivia whispered one afternoon, tracing her finger along charts showing genetic variability. In heirloom tomato strains her family had maintained for generations. According to her grandfather's records, Westbrook Heritage Farm preserved over 400 rare plant varieties that had disappeared from commercial agriculture, many with unique disease resistance and climate adaptation properties increasingly valuable. In a changing world, this discovery forced Olivia to re-evaluate her perception of her grandfather. The man she had dismissed as resistant to modern methods had actually been practicing cutting-edge genetic conservation that aligned perfectly with the historical preservation principles she had advocated for in her academic career. When the heat finally broke with late May thunderstorms, Olivia faced her first major farming decision: whether to follow the conventional planting program recommended by local agricultural suppliers or continue her grandfather's more labor-intensive heritage methods. With no experienced help available, Olivia called the one person who might offer guidance without judgment: Eleanor Summers, the county agricultural extension agent who had worked closely with Joseph over the years. The middle-aged agronomist arrived the following morning in a mud-spattered truck, her weathered face breaking into a smile as Olivia greeted her on the porch. "Never thought I'd see a Westbrook back from the big city," Eleanor said, shaking Olivia's hand firmly. "Your grandfather mentioned you were doing historical preservation work in Washington." "Agricultural document archiving," Olivia replied, feeling oddly defensive, "though I'm finding that Grandpa Joe was implementing many of the same preservation principles here all along." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Joseph was ahead of his time. Most folks around here thought he was crazy for not participating in the AgriCorps program. They couldn't understand why he'd leave money on the table. "The AgriCorps program?" Olivia asked as they walked toward the fields. "Comprehensive agricultural integration," Eleanor explained. "They control everything from seed to harvest. Proprietary. Genetics that only work with their chemical packages, GPS-guided applications, guaranteed purchase contracts. About 80% of farms in the county are enrolled. What happens to the other 20%? Eleanor's expression darkened. They're getting squeezed out. Independent operations can't compete with AgriCorps' scale and political connections. 7 family farms went under last year alone. As they surveyed the crops, Eleanor confirmed what Olivia had begun to suspect. Her grandfather's operation was deliberately designed to preserve agricultural heritage while documenting vanishing farming methods. The diversity of crops, the careful seed saving, the detailed generational records, all created a living museum more valuable than any institutional archive Olivia had ever worked with. Your grandfather believed farming wasn't just about production, but about maintaining biological and cultural memory, Eleanor said, examining a field of rare grain varieties that Joseph had meticulously documented. These heritage crops and the knowledge of how to grow them, they're disappearing faster than we can record them. What your grandfather maintained here is irreplaceable. With Eleanor's guidance, Olivia developed a management plan that would maintain her grandfather's heritage system while being manageable for a novice farmer working alone. They arranged for a local high school agricultural program to provide student volunteers in exchange for educational opportunities, with Olivia learning to manage the day-to-day operations herself. As they finished their planning session, Eleanor hesitated before returning to her truck. "There's something else you should know, Olivia. Agricor has been trying to acquire your land for years. Your grandfather turned down offers that were well above market value. Why would a corporation that size care about our relatively small farm?" Olivia asked. "Location, for one thing. Westbrook sits at a critical water access point for the county. The aquifer beneath your property feeds the entire eastern valley. But there's something else." Eleanor lowered her voice slightly. "Your grandfather discovered some inconsistencies in Agricor's seed registration documents. As an archivist, you might understand the implications better than I do." This information added another layer to the mystery of the underground room. What if the family secret wasn't just heritage seeds, but evidence of corporate misconduct that companies like Agricor would pay to keep hidden? Before Olivia could probe further, a gleaming black SUV pulled into the farmyard, bearing the green and gold Agricor logo on its door. A man in his 50s emerged, dressed in business attire that looked out of place against the working farm backdrop. "Speaking of the devil," Eleanor muttered, "that's Victor Morgan, Agricor's acquisition director, been circling like a vulture since your grandfather passed." Olivia straightened her posture, suddenly conscious of her soil-stained work clothes and the farm's modest appearance. "Thanks for the heads-up, Eleanor. I've got this." As Eleanor departed with a skeptical glance at the corporate representative, Olivia approached the visitor with forced politeness. "Can I help you?" "Victor Morgan, Agricor Agricultural Division," the man said, offering a business card and a firm handshake. "I've been trying to reach you since you arrived, Ms. Westbrook. I understand you've inherited quite a responsibility here." Olivia nodded non-committally, immediately disliking the man's presumptuous tone. "I'll be direct," Morgan continued. "Agricor would like to present a purchase offer for Westbrook Heritage Farm. Given your situation, new to farming, career elsewhere, we believe we can structure a deal that would benefit everyone." He named a figure that made Olivia blink, nearly 50% above the farm's already substantial market value. "That's certainly generous," Olivia replied carefully, thinking of the mysterious room and her grandfather's insistence that she complete a full growing season. "But I'm not in a position to consider selling yet. My grandfather's will requires that I operate the farm through harvest before making any decisions." Morgan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, family obligations. We respect that. But farming is a risky business, Ms. Westbrook, especially for someone without experience. Equipment failures, weather events, pest infestations, any number of things could turn a promising season into a financial disaster." The implied threat wasn't subtle. "Are you suggesting something might happen to my crops, Mr. Morgan?" "Not at all," Morgan replied smoothly, "simply pointing out the realities of modern agriculture. The offer I've outlined expires in 30 days. After that, market conditions may not support such generosity." He handed Olivia a thick envelope. Our full proposal, including some interesting projections about agricultural viability in this region over the next decade. I think you'll find it enlightening." After Morgan departed, Olivia opened the envelope and found not just a purchase offer, but a detailed analysis predicting increased climate instability throughout the Shenandoah Valley within 5 years. According to Agricorp's models, changing weather patterns, new pest pressures, and water access issues would make operations like Westbrook Heritage Farm increasingly vulnerable, regardless of their management practices. The final page contained a personal note. "Your grandfather was offered this same opportunity multiple times. His rejection cost him, and potentially you, millions in potential value. Don't make the same mistake." That evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Olivia sat on the farmhouse porch, the Agricorp proposal in one hand and her grandfather's farming journal in the other. The contrast between the corporation's clinical assessment of agricultural assets and her grandfather's passionate descriptions of genetic heritage couldn't have been more stark. Olivia's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Big news. Got the Smithsonian Partnership celebration dinner Friday. Any chance you can make it back to the city for the weekend?" The Smithsonian Partnership had been Olivia's initiative before. Her grandfather's death, a major collaboration she'd helped design from the ground up. Being excluded would effectively end her involvement in the institution's most prestigious project. But Friday would be a critical planting day for the heritage vegetable fields. As lightning flashed on the horizon, Olivia found herself drawn, not to her phone to respond, but to the barn where the mysterious room lay hidden. Standing before the concealed trapdoor, she lifted the wooden cover and examined the high-security door again, running her fingers over its advanced locking mechanism. The electronic sensors were sophisticated, designed not just to protect contents from unauthorized access, but to utilize structural stress detection as part of its opening system. "What were you protecting, Grandpa?" Olivia whispered. "What was worth turning down millions and straining our relationship for?" The room, designed to open only during a catastrophic barn failure, remained stubbornly sealed. When Olivia returned to the house, rain now falling in sheets, she found an email from Catherine formally requesting her decision about the Smithsonian project. With a deep breath, she replied that she would have to decline. Her obligations at Westbrook would prevent travel until at least October. The response came quickly. "I'm sorry to hear that, Olivia. We'll need to reassign your directorship consideration effective immediately. Your replacement will contact you for transition details." Just like that, the career she had spent 12 years building was slipping away. Olivia closed her laptop and walked to the window, watching lightning illuminate the fields she had reluctantly inherited. The crops weren't yet halfway to harvest, and already she had sacrificed her professional standing for this land and whatever secret it held. The mystery of the underground room had just cost her dearly. Whatever it contained would need to be worth not just the value of the farm, but the career she was watching dissolve before her eyes. As Olivia contemplated this new reality, her phone rang with an unfamiliar local number. The voice that answered her hello was elderly but sharp, a man introducing himself as Howard Garrett, her nearest neighbor to the east. "I was your grandfather's friend for 40 years, he explained. "And I know about the room you found. Before summer storms come, there are things you need to understand about your family's legacy and why Agricorp is so determined to acquire your land. Things I couldn't say over the phone." "How do you know about the room?" Olivia asked, startled. "Because I helped your grandfather build it," Howard replied. "If you want to understand what you're really protecting, come to my place tomorrow morning. The Westbrook and Garrett farms share more than just a property line, young lady. We share a secret that could change everything if we can keep it from falling into the wrong hands." Olivia agreed to the meeting, her mind racing with new questions. As she finally prepared for bed, thunder rolling across the valley. She realized something had shifted within her. What had begun as a reluctant obligation, a year of farming to secure her inheritance, had somehow transformed into something far more intriguing. Whatever secrets lay hidden in the underground room, they were clearly valuable enough that people had sacrificed careers, relationships, and millions of dollars to protect them. Whether she had intended it or not, Olivia Westbrook had become part of something much bigger than a family farm in Virginia. Outside, the summer storm nourished fields that were still largely a mystery to her. By morning, she would need to decide whether to plant not just crops, but her future in this soil, committing fully to uncovering the truth her grandfather had deemed worth protecting at all costs. The morning after the storm broke clear and bright, with puddles reflecting a cloudless sky, as Olivia drove her grandfather's old pickup down the gravel road leading to the Garrett place. Howard Garrett's property stood in stark contrast to Westbrook Farm, its fields now uniformly planted with Agricorp's proprietary crop varieties, the former vegetable gardens converted to row crops that stretched to the horizon in perfectly straight lines. The farmhouse itself remained, though it appeared diminished somehow, surrounded by industrial agriculture rather than the heritage farm it had once anchored. Howard Garrett waited on the porch, a tall man in his 70s with a weathered face and alert eyes that retained a fierce intelligence despite his age. "You have your grandmother Elizabeth's chin," he said by way of greeting, studying Olivia's face intently. "Same determined look, same way of holding your head. Joseph favored your great-grandfather's side." Olivia was taken aback. "You knew my great-grandparents?" "Thomas Westbrook was one of my father's closest friends," Howard explained, leading Olivia into a kitchen that smelled of coffee and fresh-baked bread. "Our families have been neighbors since 1935. The Garretts and the Westbrooks were part of the original group that documented American farming traditions during the Depression. We didn't just happen to settle adjacent parcels by coincidence." "What do you mean?" Olivia asked, settling at the worn kitchen table. Howard disappeared briefly into another room, returning with a leather portfolio that appeared even older than her grandfather's farm journals. "This is my father's record, passed down to me. It begins in 1934, when our families were still working for the Farm Security Administration." Olivia leaned forward, her archivist's interest genuinely piqued. She had known vaguely that her ancestors had documented farming practices, but her grandfather had rarely discussed family history beyond his own childhood. "The Westbrooks and Garretts weren't just farmers," Howard explained, opening the portfolio to reveal typewritten pages interspersed with black and white photographs and hand-drawn maps. They were part of a specialized government documentation team that worked during the Depression. They understood something that most people didn't, that America's agricultural heritage wasn't just about production, but about preserving genetic diversity and farming knowledge that was rapidly disappearing. "That's actually my specialty," Olivia remarked, surprised by the connection. "Agricultural history preservation." Howard smiled knowingly. "Not a coincidence, young lady. Your grandfather made sure you heard enough stories growing up to plant that seed, even if you didn't recognize it at the time." He turned to a carefully preserved photograph bound into the portfolio, showing a group of serious-looking men and women standing before a government building, certain faces circled in faded red ink. Our families were part of a group that called themselves the Heritage Keepers. They were farming families who also had scientific training from government conservation projects. They understood how genetic diversity worked in ways most farmers, and even most government scientists, didn't appreciate at the time. Olivia's professional skepticism stirred. Agricultural genetics has advanced significantly since the 1930s, Howard's eyes flashed. Has it? Then why are we seeing catastrophic crop failures despite billions spent on genetic engineering? The Keepers weren't just practicing Depression-era conservation, Olivia. They were preserving knowledge and living genetic material that modern development has systematically eliminated, varieties that contained resilience factors we're only now beginning to understand. He turned to another page, showing a diagram that looked remarkably similar to modern genetic diversity mapping Olivia had used in her own work. In the 1950s, when the Department of Agriculture began pushing hybrid crops and chemical-intensive farming, our fathers recognized fundamental flaws in the approaches. The USDA was using models that failed to account for how genetic narrowing would create vulnerability across the entire food system. So they became activists against the programs, Olivia asked, connecting dots that seemed increasingly plausible. They tried, but corporate agricultural interests were already powerful. Instead, they became guardians. For 3 generations, the farms at critical genetic preservation points in this valley, including Westbrook, have been maintained by families committed to heritage preservation practices that help buffer against the dangers of genetic uniformity in our food supply. Olivia recalled Eleanor mentioning that her farm held rare crop varieties that had disappeared from commercial agriculture. Varieties with unique disease resistance, increasingly valuable in a changing climate. And each family kept records, she asked, thinking of the underground room. Howard nodded. Documentation of heritage varieties, genetic adaptations, and corporate interference with proper scientific standards. Your grandfather's room contains the most comprehensive evidence, 40 years of systematic problems with the commercial seed system that Agricor deliberately buried when they took over patent registrations 20 years ago. Agricor, the same. Corporation trying to buy my farm? One and the same. They started as a chemical company that produced agricultural inputs. When they expanded into genetics with their Agricor Seeds division, they created a perfect corporate loop, patenting narrow genetic lines, then selling the chemicals those varieties depend on, then buying up farms ruined by the resulting vulnerabilities. The system works brilliantly until something disrupts it, like a novel plant disease or climate shift. Olivia ran a hand through her hair, her archivist's mind processing this information against her professional knowledge. This sounds like a massive failure of oversight. The oversight agencies were captured decades ago, Howard explained. That's all documented in your grandfather's collection. Agricor executives have cycled through the USDA, the patent office, and back to corporate positions for years. They've systematically undermined every attempt to address the genetic vulnerabilities. Olivia thought about the seed registration inconsistencies Eleanor had mentioned. So my grandfather was collecting evidence of corporate corruption and genetic vulnerability, evidence that would stand up in scientific review. Howard confirmed, Agricor knows about the room, but not its exact contents or location. They've been trying to acquire all the keeper properties for years, systematically eliminating the independent oversight we've maintained. He gestured sadly toward his window. They got my place 5 years ago when medical bills from my wife's cancer left me no choice. Your grandfather helped me save the most critical documents before the sale. He knew they would come for Westbrook next, which is why he became so insistent about preserving the farm's independence. Olivia's mind flashed to her grandfather's. Heart attack while repairing the barn roof, a death that had seemed like terrible luck at the time. The pressure from Agricor contributed to my grandfather's death, didn't it? Howard's expression turned grave. I can't prove it, but the timing was suspicious. Joseph had finally compiled enough evidence to take to federal investigators. 3 days before his scheduled meeting in Washington, the heart attack happened. Police found nothing suspicious, but it removed the most significant threat to Agricor's operations, and left the evidence locked in a room that seems impossible to access. Olivia finished, a chill running through her, despite the warm kitchen. Your grandfather fought them with everything he had, Howard continued. When direct offers didn't work, they tried other tactics, manipulating water district decisions, pressuring equipment dealers to delay repairs during critical planting periods, even attempting to influence bank loan officers to call in operating lines of credit. That's illegal, Olivia protested, and nearly impossible to prove when you're one farmer against a corporation with more lawyers than the state. Government, Howard replied. This isn't just about business for them, Olivia. The evidence in that room threatens the very foundation of their regional operations. The myth that their genetically uniform crops protect our food security when in fact they're engineered to create dependency rather than resilience. Olivia thought about the sophisticated electronic lock on her grandfather's underground room, designed to open only during the kind of structural failure that would provide physical access to the evidence documented inside. So, what's actually in the room? Scientific data, genetic samples, corporate documents, much more, Howard said. Your grandfather was also a meticulous record keeper. For 40 years, he systematically documented unauthorized genetic manipulations, suppressed research on crop vulnerabilities, and most damning of all, the deliberate narrowing of genetic diversity in our food supply to increase dependency on proprietary chemicals. The room contains living seed samples, research journals, and internal AgriCorps documents leaked by whistleblowers who've since been silenced through settlements. The electronic lock system ensures it can only be accessed when physically necessary, preventing AgriCorps from claiming that Joseph fabricated evidence. Olivia sat back, overwhelmed by implications. If Howard was right, her grandfather hadn't been merely a stubborn traditionalist clinging to outdated farming methods. He had been the final guardian of evidence that could potentially expose decades of corporate negligence and corruption affecting the safety of America's entire food system. Why didn't my grandfather ever tell me any of this? Olivia asked, a familiar hurt resurfacing. Why keep me in the dark if it was so important? Howard's expression softened. Joseph always planned to share everything when you were ready. But then you chose a different path, showing more interest in institutional archives than in what seemed like a small family farm. The keeper knowledge can't be fully understood through documents alone. It must be experienced through living on the land and observing how plants actually express their genetic heritage in this specific landscape. He reached across the table, placing a weathered hand over Olivia's. He was immensely proud of your archival work, Olivia. He told me often. But he also believed that understanding agricultural heritage required both academic knowledge and direct experience with the crops. That's why his will requires you to complete a full growing season. He wanted you to see how plants behave across different weather patterns before you access the evidence. Olivia thought about her grandfather's letter. What you'll find will change your understanding of this land and possibly your path forward. The words carried new weight now. I'm still not sure I believe all this, she admitted. But AgriCorps' interest is undeniable, and their tactics seem increasingly aggressive. You don't need to believe everything today, Howard said gently. Just run your farm, observe your crops, and pay special attention to how the heritage varieties respond to different conditions. The plants themselves will show you much of what you need to understand before the room opens. Before Olivia left, Howard gave her a small flash drive. Your grandfather's backup of essential documents, not everything in the room, but enough to understand what you're dealing with. He made me promise to give this to you only if you seemed ready to accept the responsibility. Olivia accepted the drive, weighing it in her palm, an ordinary-looking device that supposedly contained extraordinary evidence. What happens if AgriCorps gets control of all the keeper farms and the documentation? Howard's expression darkened. Then the next major crop disease won't just damage harvests, it will threaten the entire food supply. The genetic uniformity in our agricultural system is far more dangerous than official reports indicate. Without independent preservation and the diversity management practices your grandfather maintained, a catastrophic failure is inevitable. As Olivia drove back to Westbrook Heritage Farm, the summer sun warming fields now revealing their patterns. To her more experienced eye, she felt the weight of a legacy far heavier than she had imagined. She had inherited not just a farm, but a final line of defense, protecting an entire food system from both corporate greed and engineered vulnerability. Whether Howard's alarming story was entirely true remained to be seen, but the pressure from Agricor, her grandfather's secretive behavior, and the elaborate room with its failure-triggered lock all suggested something extraordinary was indeed at stake. Olivia parked beside the farmhouse and walked to the edge of the closest field. She knelt and examined a row of heirloom beans her grandfather had carefully maintained for generations, seeing them now not merely as quaint curiosities, but as sophisticated, living archives of genetic resilience. Had her grandfather been right? Had decades of industrial agriculture and patented seed systems created a disaster waiting to happen? The archivist in her demanded evidence, but another part, perhaps the part that connected her to generations of Westbrooks before her, felt a stirring of recognition. This land had helped protect agricultural heritage for decades, despite economic pressures that had driven most small farms out of business. If there was even a chance that Howard's story contained truth, she owed it to her grandfather's memory. To investigate it. With new determination, Olivia reached for her phone and called Eleanor Summers at the extension office. "I need to understand more about the genetic diversity in these heritage crops," she said, when Eleanor answered, "especially around disease resistance profiles, and I'll need access to historical planting data for the region." The scientific method, Olivia decided, would be her path to the truth. She would run Westbrook Heritage Farm as her grandfather had, while simultaneously applying her archival expertise to verify the claims about genetic vulnerability. The room might remain locked until a catastrophic barn failure, but that didn't mean she couldn't begin piecing together the truth her grandfather had dedicated his life to protecting. June brought unusually violent weather to the Shenandoah Valley. What normally would have been a welcome transition to summer became a source of growing concern as weather systems stalled over the region, bringing increasingly severe thunderstorms and tornado warnings. For the past 3 weeks, Olivia had divided her time between managing the farm and conducting a methodical investigation into American seed heritage and corporate patent records. The flash drive Howard had given her contained dozens of technical documents, research reports, original genetic profiles, and years of her grandfather's personal observations that painted a disturbing picture when compared with Olivia's professional knowledge of proper historical preservation. Most alarming were the photographs documenting gradual narrowing of genetic diversity in common crop varieties. Subtle changes that wouldn't be obvious to non-specialists, but that collectively reduced crops' capacity to withstand novel diseases or climate stress, particularly in varieties surrounding independent farms. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Someone had deliberately engineered vulnerabilities into the system. On a stormy Wednesday morning, Olivia sat at her kitchen table reviewing USDA crop disease reports from the past decade when her phone rang. Eleanor Whitaker, calling with urgency in her voice. "Olivia, have you seen the latest forecast? The National Weather Service just upgraded to a severe tornado warning. They're predicting a supercell system moving through the valley within the next 24 hours with conditions nearly identical to the 2004 outbreak." Olivia had been monitoring the situation but hadn't seen the newest update. How severe are the projected winds? Potentially F3 or higher, with the most dangerous conditions focused directly over the Eastern Valley. The County Emergency Management Office is preparing for potential evacuations. The 2004 tornado outbreak had been the most destructive in recent memory, but it had primarily affected the western portions of the valley, areas now largely controlled by Agricor. The Eastern Valley, where Olivia's farm was located, had been spared during that event, despite being in the projected path. "What's Agricor saying?" Olivia asked, knowing the corporation effectively controlled regional emergency response through its dominance of local government. Eleanor's tone darkened. "That's what concerns me. Their representatives at this morning's emergency management meeting seemed almost unconcerned about the Eastern Valley. They're focusing all resources on protecting their seed storage facilities and processing plants in the Western Quadrant." This aligned with the evidence Olivia had been reviewing, a pattern of prioritizing corporate assets over community safety. "I need to check something. I'll call you back." Ending the call, Olivia pulled up the detailed weather maps her grandfather had annotated over decades. Joseph Westbrook had methodically documented how storms actually moved through the landscape during various weather events, creating a more accurate model than the official forecasts. According to these observations, if a major tornado struck at specific points that Olivia now suspected had been deliberately left unprotected, the resulting destruction would predominantly affect non-Agricor properties while sparing the corporation's holdings. Grabbing her rain gear, Olivia inspected the century-old barn. Its heavy timber construction had weathered countless storms before, but she noticed concerning details: weakened roof trusses, degraded bracing, and, most worryingly, signs of recent activity. Someone had been here within the past few days. Fresh cuts appeared on several critical support beams, and the security system she'd installed showed evidence of having been temporarily disabled. As a trained preservationist, Olivia recognized the hallmarks of what could be emergency reinforcement or something more sinister: strategic weakening of key structural elements. Her suspicions deepening, Olivia called Howard Garrett. "Has Agricor done any unusual inspections of your old farm buildings recently?" 3 days ago, Howard confirmed. "Middle of the night, according to my neighbor. When he questioned the crew, they claimed it was standard pre-storm insurance assessment, but they only examined the historic structures, not the modern Agricor facilities." "Same here," Olivia replied, unease growing. "I think they're selectively weakening certain buildings, decreating failure points where they want the damage to occur." Howard concluded grimly. "Your grandfather documented them doing the same thing before the 2004 tornadoes. 4 historic farms with heritage seed collections were destroyed, while Agricor properties remained intact." Olivia's preservation training battled with what seemed like conspiracy thinking, but the evidence was becoming difficult to dismiss. The selective inspections, the corporate indifference to Eastern Valley preparations, the historical pattern of convenient building failures, it all suggested deliberate design of destruction paths to eliminate competition while maintaining plausible deniability. Back at the farmhouse, Olivia made a decisive move. She called the Regional Historic Preservation Office and reached Diana Rodriguez, a senior structural engineer she'd worked with on Washington preservation projects. "Diana, I need a professional opinion on some concerning structural patterns I'm seeing on several historic barns in the Shenandoah Valley," she explained, detailing her observations without revealing her suspicions of deliberate sabotage. "That's Agricor territory now," Diana replied cautiously. "They've held most of the historic preservation contracts for that region for 10 years. Our oversight is limited to annual inspections." "When was the last inspection?" A pause. 16 months ago. Budget cuts have reduced our monitoring capacity." As a licensed preservationist, I'm observing potential structural concerns that warrant immediate attention, Olivia pressed, using the formal language that would register as a reportable safety alert. With current tornado forecasts, I believe there's significant risk to historic structures and possibly lives. Diana's tone shifted from bureaucratic to professional concern. I can dispatch an emergency assessment team, but not until tomorrow morning at the earliest. The Western Valley situation is all hands right now. Tomorrow might be too late, Olivia replied, watching the rain intensify outside her window. The storm system is already within 50 miles and intensifying rapidly. After ending the call, Olivia faced a difficult decision. Official channels would not respond quickly enough, but taking independent action carried significant risk, both physical danger and potential legal consequences for interfering with structures that might be deliberately compromised. As evening approached, the storm became ferocious. Weather radar showed the system developing exactly as predicted, a vast supercell centered directly over the upper valley. Emergency alerts confirmed what Olivia already knew. They were hours, not days, from potential disaster. Unable to wait for official response, Olivia loaded her truck with emergency supplies, tarps, rope, bracing materials, and the tools she would need to attempt emergency reinforcement of the most vulnerable barn sections. As she prepared to leave, her phone rang. Marcus calling from Washington. "Olivia, the news is showing serious tornado warnings headed your way. Are you evacuating?" His concern was genuine, but Olivia had no time to explain the complex situation. "I'm staying. There are things I need to do here." "That's insane. The Weather Service is predicting potential structural failures across the valley. You need to leave now while the roads are still passable." "I can't, Marcus. This farm contains irreplaceable agricultural heritage that can't be moved. I need to protect it." The silence on the line spoke volumes. "This is about more than just the farm, isn't it? This is about whatever your grandfather was involved in." "Yes," Olivia admitted, "and it turns out he was right. I need to go now." "Be careful," he said finally. "And Olivia, I'm proud of you for whatever it is you're doing. I can hear it in your voice. This matters." As darkness fell, Olivia worked in the howling wind, attempting to reinforce the barn's most vulnerable sections. She secured loose materials, braced weakened supports, and created emergency water diversion channels where complete protection wasn't possible. Her preservation expertise complemented her growing understanding of the property, creating solutions that might mitigate the worst impacts when the storm struck directly. Around midnight, with the wind now threatening to tear the roof from the barn, headlights appeared on the access road. An AgriCorps security vehicle approached, stopping at the edge of the farmyard. Two men emerged, their corporate logos visible, on rain gear as they approached. "This is private property under advisory evacuation order," the lead figure announced, his voice barely audible over the storm. "You need to vacate immediately for your own safety." Olivia stepped forward, rain streaming down her face. "I'm a licensed historical preservationist, documenting potential structural concerns in advance of a state inspection. This property remains under my ownership and management." It was a legal assertion of her rights, but the security team seemed prepared for resistance. Their supervisor spoke into a radio, receiving instructions that clearly frustrated him. "You've been warned officially," he stated finally. "AgriCorps bears no responsibility for any injuries sustained during a severe weather event after evacuation recommendations." The team retreated to their vehicle, but remained parked at the access point, monitoring but not interfering. They wouldn't stop her directly, too much liability, but they were documenting her presence to protect themselves when the storm hit. When the barn failed, Agricor would claim they had tried to encourage evacuation from dangerous structures, portraying any failures as acts of God rather than results of negligence or deliberate sabotage. By 2 a.m., the situation had deteriorated significantly. The storm had reached full force, and the barn was beginning to creak and groan despite Olivia's reinforcement efforts. The National Weather Service had issued tornado warnings for several locations in the valley, and emergency sirens echoed across the countryside. Olivia had done what she could to protect the structure, but nature's raw power was overwhelming her efforts. As she secured the last brace, a thunderous roar filled the night. Not thunder, but the unmistakable freight train sound of an approaching tornado. The barn began to shake violently, its century-old timbers protesting against forces they had never been designed to withstand. Olivia barely had time to take shelter in the reinforced basement of the farmhouse before the tornado struck. The world outside became chaos, a deafening roar punctuated by the sounds of destruction as the storm carved its path through Westbrook Heritage Farm. For 20 terrifying minutes, Olivia huddled in the darkness, listening to the devastation. Above, when the noise finally subsided, replaced by the steady drumming of rain, she emerged to assess the damage, flashlight in hand. The farmhouse had survived with minimal damage, losing shingles and windows but remaining structurally sound. The fields showed the tornado's erratic path, with some areas untouched while others were scoured to bare earth. But it was the barn that had taken the direct hit. The historic structure that had stood for over a century was now a jumble of broken timbers and scattered debris, its roof entirely gone and 3 walls collapsed inward. And there, in the center of the destruction, exposed by the storm's violence, was the underground room, its reinforced door now visible beneath the shattered floorboards, exactly as her grandfather had described. The complex electronic lock, designed to activate only during a catastrophic structural failure, now glowed with a steady green light, indicating it was finally accessible. As dawn broke, revealing the full extent of the destruction across the valley, Olivia stood before the exposed underground room, key in hand. The storm had taken her barn, but revealed the truth her grandfather had protected for decades. With grim determination, she descended into the chamber, ready to face whatever secrets lay within, secrets so important that others had engineered tonight's destruction to access them. What she couldn't know was that Agricor representatives were already on their way, alerted by the security team that had observed the barn's destruction. By sunrise, Olivia would be confronted not just with the truth about America's agricultural vulnerability, but with those determined to keep that truth buried beneath the storm's wreckage. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape. Where Olivia's meticulously maintained heritage crops had stretched just yesterday, a chaotic mosaic now lay, some fields untouched, others completely devastated, the tornado's capricious path written across the land. The morning light revealed what darkness had hidden. The true extent of the destruction focused precisely where Howard had predicted, on heritage farms and historic structures, while Agricor's vast corporate fields appeared largely unscathed. The century-old barn that had been Westbrook Farm's centerpiece was now reduced to a scatter of timbers and broken boards, its massive oak frame, which had withstood 100 years of storms, finally defeated. At the center of the destruction, gleaming incongruously amid the splintered wood and hay, sat the exposed underground room, its reinforced concrete shell now visible to the open sky. Olivia stood at the edge of the devastation, key in hand, her hair still damp from the rain that had followed the tornado. She had barely slept, spending most of the night documenting the damage pattern across her property and comparing it with historical records her grandfather had maintained of previous natural disasters. The correlation was too perfect to be coincidence. The tornado's path had struck historic structures with precision while leaving modern agricore facilities largely untouched. Most disturbing were the fresh cuts she'd discovered on key structural supports before the storm, strategic weakening that would direct a collapse rather than prevent it. Someone had wanted this barn to fail catastrophically, exposing the underground room in a way that would appear to be an act of nature rather than deliberate sabotage. Carefully navigating the debris field, Olivia approached the exposed underground chamber. The sophisticated electronic lock now glowed green, its sensors having detected the structural failure that served as its opening trigger. The key her grandfather had left felt warm in her palm, as if the metal itself recognized its moment had finally arrived. Descending the concrete stairs into the room felt like stepping into another world. Unlike the rustic farm above, this chamber resembled a high-tech research laboratory combined with a climate-controlled archive. Stainless steel shelving lined the walls, holding hundreds of carefully labeled seed samples in specialized storage containers. Scientific equipment, much of it decades old but meticulously maintained, occupied one corner. The center of the room featured a large work table covered with research journals and documentation binders arranged in precise chronological order. Most striking were the floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets along the back wall, each drawer labeled with corporate names and years spanning from the 1970s to the present. One cabinet, newer than the others, bore the AgriCore logo and contained dozens of folders marked classified and proprietary, authorized viewing only. "My God, Grandpa," Olivia whispered, her archivist's heart racing at the scope of the collection. "You built an entire underground research archive." For the next hour, Olivia methodically photographed and catalogued the room's contents, her professional training taking over despite her emotional turmoil. This wasn't just a collection of farming memorabilia, it was a comprehensive scientific archive documenting decades of agricultural history and corporate manipulation, maintained with a level of precision that would satisfy the most demanding academic standards. The seed vault alone contained over 600 distinct varieties, many labeled as extinct in commercial agriculture or last known viable sample. Each container included detailed documentation of growing conditions, disease resistance profiles, nutritional content, and climate adaptability, precisely the kind of information modern seed companies claim to be proprietary trade secrets. In the AgriCore cabinet, Olivia discovered what appeared to be internal corporate documents, research reports showing failed disease resistance in genetically engineered crops, memos discussing the suppression of independent studies, and most damning strategic plans for eliminating heritage seed preservation through targeted acquisition of family farms. One folder, labeled Project Vulnerability, contained what appeared to be the smoking gun, a comprehensive analysis of how genetic uniformity in commercial agriculture created catastrophic vulnerability to novel plant diseases, along with risk assessments calculating the acceptable economic losses from potential crop failures against the cost of maintaining broader genetic diversity. The documents revealed a corporate strategy of deliberate vulnerability, narrowing the genetic base to increase dependency on proprietary chemicals and patented seeds, while systematically eliminating the heritage varieties that might provide resistance to emerging threats. It wasn't just unethical. It represented an existential threat to food security that had been deliberately concealed from the public and regulatory agencies. As Olivia absorbed the magnitude of what she'd discovered, she heard vehicles approaching on the gravel driveway. Moving to the entrance of the underground room, she saw 3 black SUVs with the AgriCore logo pull into the farmyard, followed by what appeared to be a private security team in tactical gear. A dozen men deployed around the property with practiced efficiency, establishing a perimeter while corporate executives emerged from the lead vehicle. In the center of the group stood Victor Morgan, Agricor's acquisition director, now flanked by a woman in an expensive suit who carried herself with unmistakable authority. They surveyed the tornado damage with expressions that struck Olivia as oddly satisfied rather than concerned, conversing quietly while pointing toward the exposed underground room. Olivia's immediate instinct was to hide, but she realized this would only confirm their suspicions that she had accessed the room. Instead, she stood her ground at the edge of the debris field, letting them approach while surreptitiously slipping a handful of the most damning documents into her jacket pocket. Her phone was already recording, capturing every word and action. "Ms. Westbrook," Morgan called as they neared. "Thank goodness you're safe. We came as soon as we heard about the tornado damage." "Very considerate of you," Olivia replied coldly, "especially since your security team was monitoring my property all night and must have seen the barn collapse hours ago." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly at this direct accusation, but her professional smile remained fixed. "I'm Alexandra Keller, Chief Operating Officer for Agricor Biotechnology. We're here to offer immediate assistance in this tragic situation." Olivia studied Keller with new understanding. According to her grandfather's documents, this woman had overseen the systematic acquisition of heritage farms for over a decade, personally directing the strategic vulnerability program that had deliberately narrowed America's agricultural genetic base. "Please come to the house," Olivia offered, her tone neutral. "I think we all know why you're really here." The farmhouse. Kitchen, though wind-damaged along one wall, remained functional. Olivia had prepared coffee, the homey gesture incongruous with the destruction visible through every window. Morgan and Keller sat uncomfortably, declining refreshments as they assessed the situation. "Ms. Westbrook, we understand the storm has exposed certain research materials your grandfather maintained," Keller began, dispensing with further pretense. "In light of this unfortunate natural disaster, Agricor is prepared to offer extraordinary assistance." "Natural disaster?" Olivia repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling engineered structural failures now?" Morgan shifted uneasily, but Keller maintained her composure. "Tornadoes are complex meteorological events with many contributing factors. What matters now is helping this community recover." "Let's be direct," Olivia suggested. "You believe I've accessed evidence showing Agricor deliberately engineered genetic vulnerability in our food system to increase dependency on your products. You're here to buy that evidence and my silence rather than deny the accusation." Keller reached into her briefcase and removed a document folder. "We're here to offer a comprehensive recovery package that recognizes your unique situation. Agricor is prepared to purchase Westbrook Heritage Farm at 300% of pre-storm market value, with additional compensation for structural losses and emotional distress." She slid a paper across the table, and Olivia glanced at the figure. Nearly $7 million, far more than the property had ever been worth. "That's very generous," Olivia acknowledged. "And in exchange, we would require transfer of all research materials related to agricultural genetics, a standard non-disclosure agreement, and your public support for Agricor's community recovery initiatives." Olivia leaned back, appearing to consider the offer. "And if I decline?" Keller's expression hardened slightly. "Ms. Westbrook, you're facing complete financial ruin. Your barn is destroyed, your heritage crops compromised, and insurance typically excludes coverage for acts of God. Moreover, pursuing unsubstantiated allegations against a company dedicated to feeding this nation would be inadvisable, especially given what happened to others who tried." "Like my grandfather," Olivia added, watching Keller's reaction carefully. The executive maintained her composure, but a flash of something, concern perhaps, crossed her features. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I assure you, Agricor is focused solely on agricultural advancement and community recovery now. Olivia stood and walked to the window, surveying the storm damage. I reviewed everything in my grandfather's room last night, Miss Keller. Not just the research journals, but the corporate documents. Howard Garrett's sudden foreclosure after he testified at a USDA hearing. The mysterious crop failures that bankrupted the Peterson farm before the 2015 tornado. My grandfather's heart attack 3 days before his scheduled meeting with federal investigators. She turned back to face the executives. And I found something particularly interesting about you, Ms. Keller. Before joining Agricor, you worked for the USDA's Genetic Diversity Program, specifically overseeing the same seed registration processes you later helped circumvent. The documents show you were paid $2 million in consulting fees channeled through shell companies after approving regulatory changes that deliberately weakened genetic diversity protections around non-Agricor varieties. The color drained from Keller's face. This specific detail hadn't been in any news reports or public allegations. It existed only in the private documentation Joseph Westbrook had assembled. You've been misinformed, Keller stated flatly, though her confident demeanor had cracked. But this illustrates why emotional responses to natural disasters can be problematic. People seek someone to blame. I don't need to seek anyone, Olivia replied. My grandfather already found those responsible and documented everything. The only question remaining is who I share that information with and when. Morgan, visibly uncomfortable with how the conversation had developed, attempted intervention. Ms. Westbrook, regardless of any misunderstandings, the offer on the table provides immediate financial security when you need it most. Your barn is gone. Your historic preservation is compromised. This is an opportunity to walk away with your future secured. Olivia considered them both, thinking of the destruction surrounding her and the years her grandfather had spent assembling evidence. At tremendous personal cost, the offer was indeed tempting, enough money to start a new life anywhere, free from obligation and risk. But the documents in the underground room haunted her. Gene sequence analyses showing deliberate vulnerability, corporate calculations of acceptable casualties in pursuit of market dominance, and most damning, Agricor's internal assessments of how climate change would interact with their engineered genetic bottlenecks to create food system collapse. I need some time to consider, Olivia said finally. This is obviously a significant decision. Keller glanced at her watch. We can give you 1 hour, Ms. Westbrook. Our emergency response teams need coordination regarding this property one way or another. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Accept their offer or face whatever emergency response they deemed appropriate for someone refusing cooperation. As the executives prepared to return to their vehicles, Olivia asked one final question. Out of curiosity, what would prevent me from taking your money and still sharing the evidence with authorities? Morgan looked alarmed at the direct question, but Keller smiled thinly. The agreement includes certain provisions that would make such actions profoundly regrettable. Agricor protects its interests comprehensively, Ms. Westbrook. I imagine you do, Olivia replied, watching them walk toward their waiting SUVs. As they drove across the farmyard to establish a temporary command post near the destroyed barn, Olivia didn't waste a moment. She gathered the most critical evidence into her backpack, unique seed samples, her grandfather's primary research journal, and a selection of the most damning corporate documents. Her phone already contained hundreds of photographs documenting the underground room's contents. The executives clearly hadn't been satisfied with her response and wouldn't wait a full hour before taking more direct action. The fact that they had arrived with a private security team and established a perimeter around her property suggested they had contingency plans for resistance. Olivia checked her watch. 7:15 a.m. She needed to move quickly and strategically. From the farmhouse window, she observed Keller on her phone, while the security team began examining the underground room, cataloging its contents with professional efficiency. As Olivia had predicted, they weren't planning to wait for her decision. The game was changing, and she needed to adapt immediately. Olivia's plan came together with clarity born of desperation. Agricor wanted the evidence contained in that room, but they didn't yet realize she had already documented its contents and secured the most critical items. More importantly, they didn't know about Howard Garrett's flash drive or the backup, documentation her grandfather had distributed to trusted colleagues over the years. Moving quickly through the house, Olivia gathered essential supplies and headed for the back door, where her grandfather's old ATV was parked under a lean-to that had survived the storm. The vehicle wasn't fast or impressive, but it knew the farm's hidden paths and could traverse terrain the Agricor SUVs couldn't follow. Just as she prepared to leave, her phone vibrated with an incoming call. Eleanor Summers, the agricultural extension agent. Olivia, thank God. We've been trying to reach you since the tornado hit. Are you safe? For now, Olivia replied quickly. Eleanor, I need your help. Agricor executives and a security team are at my farm right now. They're trying to seize evidence my grandfather collected about their genetic manipulation program. The Heritage Keeper archives, Eleanor confirmed, clearly familiar with what Olivia was describing. Your grandfather told me they existed, but not their location. The agricultural community has whispered about them for years. They're real, and I've accessed them. The room was exposed when the barn collapsed, which wasn't an accident. I need to get this evidence to federal authorities, but Agricor is moving to contain the situation. Eleanor's voice lowered, even over the secure line. The State Agricultural Commissioner just announced an emergency session to approve a disaster recovery plan, including immediate purchase offers for storm-damaged historic farms at triple market value. The funding is coming through a public-private partnership with Agricor. They're moving fast, Olivia observed, using the disaster to acquire what they couldn't get through normal pressure tactics. Exactly, and there's more. The FEMA team that was supposed to deploy for disaster assessment has been mysteriously delayed by administrative processing. The only emergency resources in the area are being coordinated through Agricor's corporate response team. This aligned perfectly with the evidence Olivia had reviewed overnight. Agricor consistently positioned itself as the savior during disasters it had helped engineer, using crisis conditions to expand control while appearing benevolent. What about media coverage? Olivia asked. Local stations are running Agricor press releases verbatim. National crews are being kept at safe distances from the most affected areas, supposedly for safety reasons. Olivia checked her watch. 7:25 a.m. Listen carefully. At 9 a.m., I need you to make sure independent agricultural scientists and whatever media you can find are at Howard Garrett's place. Tell them a storm victim has critical information about genetic manipulation and corporate sabotage. Olivia, what are you planning? Just be ready. And Eleanor, contact Professor Diane Matthews at the Smithsonian Agricultural Archives. Tell her I found evidence of patent violations in the heritage seed system. Use those exact words, she'll understand. After ending the transmission, Olivia turned her attention to final preparations. The farmhouse stood on high ground that had kept it mostly intact despite the tornado's devastation. From the back windows, she had clear views of the Agricor team, now systematically cataloging and removing materials from the underground room. They were working with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for, suggesting they had prior knowledge of at least some of the room's contents. She had separated the evidence into multiple caches, some hidden throughout the farmhouse, others packed in her backpack. The most critical seed samples were sealed in specialized containers her grandfather had prepared years earlier, designed to maintain viability even under adverse conditions. Her phone contained hundreds of photographs of documents, and Howard's flash drive was securely hidden in a waterproof container. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Olivia saw Keller dispatch 2 security teams to different areas of the property. One began a systematic search of the farmhouse perimeter, while another established positions blocking the main driveway. They weren't being subtle anymore. This was now effectively a containment operation to secure both the evidence and Olivia herself. She waited until the search team circled to the front of the house before slipping out the back door to the ATV. The morning fog that had settled in the low areas provided natural concealment as she started the vehicle and navigated away from the buildings, following an overgrown trail that led through a wooded area toward the eastern property boundary. Her grandfather had maintained these hidden access routes specifically for emergency egress, anticipating a day when AgriCorps might move against the farm directly. The security team quickly discovered her absence, and Olivia heard vehicles starting behind her as she reached the tree line. The ATV couldn't outrun their SUVs on open ground, but in the dense woodland and ravines that separated Westbrook Farm from the neighboring properties, she had the advantage of intimate knowledge and a smaller, more nimble vehicle. For 20 tense minutes, Olivia navigated increasingly rugged terrain, using natural features to break line of sight with her pursuers. The security team had split up, attempting to flank her escape route, but they were hampered by unfamiliarity with the land and the storm debris that now blocked many conventional access points. When she finally emerged from the forest onto Howard Garrett's property, Olivia was both physically and emotionally exhausted, but resolute in her purpose. The evidence she carried represented not just her grandfather's legacy, but potentially the future security of America's food system, a heritage too valuable to surrender to corporate containment. Howard himself waited on his porch, a shotgun across his knees, clearly having observed the AgriCorps vehicles searching the boundary areas. "Right on time," he said as she approached. "Your grandfather would be proud." "They're not far behind," Olivia warned, dismounting from the ATV, "and they're not pretending anymore." Howard nodded toward his driveway, where several vehicles were now arriving. Eleanor Summers in her county truck, accompanied by 3 journalists from regional papers and a van from the nearest university's agricultural research department. "Neither are we." As Olivia caught her breath, Howard explained the situation to the new arrivals. The journalists began photographing the AgriCorps security teams now visible at the property boundary, while the university researchers carefully examined the seed samples Olivia had rescued from the underground room. "These are extinct varieties," one professor exclaimed, holding up a container labeled Midwestern Drought-Resistant Wheat, 1932 strain. This genetic line was reported completely lost in the 1980s. The disease resistance profile alone could be worth billions in modern breeding programs. Eleanor joined Olivia on the porch, examining the corporate documents she had salvaged. "This is worse than we imagined. They didn't just narrow the genetic base accidentally through commercialization. They deliberately eliminated resistant varieties to create dependency on their chemical treatments." The scientific evidence was damning, but it was the corporate strategy documents that truly revealed the scope of AgriCorps' program. Detailed analyses showed how they had systematically acquired and then eliminated heritage varieties that demonstrated natural resistance to common agricultural diseases, creating an artificial dependency on proprietary chemical treatments and genetically modified alternatives. Most disturbing were the risk assessment reports calculating the acceptable loss thresholds for potential crop failures against the cost of maintaining broader genetic diversity. Agricor had deliberately engineered vulnerability into America's food system, knowing it created catastrophic risk because the profit from dependency outweighed the cost of potential collapse, especially if they could control the narrative when failures occurred. As the group reviewed the evidence, vehicles appeared on Howard's driveway, Agricor security teams attempting to contain the situation now that it had escaped Westbrook Farm. But unlike their earlier unopposed operation, they now faced journalists, documenting their every move, and university scientists protecting evidence of immense scientific value. Keller herself emerged from the lead vehicle, her corporate composure visibly strained as she assessed the changed situation. "Ms. Westbrook," she called, approaching the porch, "you're removing proprietary materials from a disaster site, Agricor, as legal ownership rights to agricultural patents that may be compromised by unauthorized distribution." Olivia stood, facing the executive directly. "Nothing here is proprietary, Ms. Keller. These are heritage seed varieties developed by farmers over generations, documented by my grandfather using public scientific protocols. Your company's efforts to eliminate them through market manipulation doesn't create ownership rights." One of the university researchers stepped forward, a distinguished botanist Olivia recognized from agricultural conferences. "I can confirm these samples represent historic varieties that predate modern patent law. They constitute an irreplaceable scientific and cultural heritage, not corporate property." The journalists were recording every word, creating the public documentation that Agricor had worked so hard to prevent. As the confrontation unfolded, more vehicles arrived. Local farmers alerted by Eleanor, agricultural students from the community college, and most significantly, a black SUV bearing federal government markings. From this vehicle emerged two individuals who changed the dynamic instantly. Professor Diane Matthews from the Smithsonian, accompanied by a Department of Justice attorney specializing in agricultural patent law. They approached with the unmistakable authority of federal officials on official business. "Dr. Matthews," Keller acknowledged stiffly, "this is an unexpected pleasure." "I'm sure it is," Matthews replied coldly. "The Smithsonian has been investigating the systematic elimination of agricultural genetic diversity for 3 years, Ms. Keller. Joseph Westbrook was one of our confidential sources before his untimely death. When we received word that his archive had been compromised in a convenient tornado strike, we expedited our field assessment." The DOJ attorney stepped forward. "Agricor personnel are instructed to cease all collection activities at both the Westbrook property and this location pending federal investigation. Any materials already removed from the underground facility must be surrendered to our custody immediately for chain of evidence documentation." Keller's composed facade finally cracked. "This is absurd. We're providing emergency disaster response to affected farmers, not conducting collection activities." These allegations of corporate manipulation are the desperate conspiracy theories of a family that refused to modernize their farming practices. "Then you won't mind if we examine the materials you've already loaded into your vehicles?" Matthews responded evenly. "A scientific review will quickly determine whether they constitute heritage agricultural resources or, as you claim, irrelevant historical curiosities." The standoff continued for several tense minutes before Keller finally conceded the inevitable. With journalists documenting every movement and federal officials now on site, Agricor's containment strategy had failed. The evidence, both the physical seeds and the documentary proof of corporate manipulation, would now undergo formal scientific and legal review beyond their control. As Agricor personnel retreated to their vehicles, Olivia felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. The farm she had reluctantly inherited, learned to appreciate, and gradually come to understand was partially destroyed. The career she had built in Washington seemed increasingly distant. Yet standing on Howard's porch, surrounded by people committed to agricultural heritage and scientific integrity, she felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything she had experienced in years of archival work. "Your grandfather would be proud," Howard said quietly, standing beside her. "He always said you'd find your way back to what matters, even if you took a different path to get there." Eldona joined them, holding one of the heritage seed containers. "What happens now?" Olivia looked out over the valley where generations of farmers had maintained America's agricultural diversity against increasing pressure to surrender it to corporate control. The morning sun illuminated fields still wet from the storm's passage, the soil ready for renewal despite the night's violence. "Now we rebuild," she said with quiet determination. "Not just structures, but systems. The evidence is secure, but the real work, protecting agricultural heritage for future generations, is just beginning." As federal officials began documenting the evidence for formal investigation, Olivia realized her grandfather's legacy wasn't just the physical seeds or damning documents, but something far more valuable: the understanding that preserving our agricultural heritage wasn't just about honoring the past, but about securing humanity's future against those who would engineer vulnerability for profit. The storm had destroyed her barn and exposed the underground room, but in doing so, it had revealed a truth that no corporate containment could now suppress. What had begun as a reluctant obligation to fulfill her grandfather's will had transformed into a mission that would shape not just her life, but potentially the future of American agriculture itself. 6 months after the tornado that changed everything, Olivia Westbrook stood on the hilltop overlooking what had once been her grandfather's barn. The November morning frost glittered across the rebuilt fields, transforming the landscape with a silvery sheen that concealed the scars of that fateful night. From this vantage point, she could see how much had changed, not just physically, but in purpose and meaning. Where the century-old barn had once stood, a new structure now rose against the autumn sky. Not a traditional farm building, but a state-of-the-art agricultural research center with glass walls that caught the morning light. The Westbrook Heritage Seed Preservation Institute read the sign at its entrance, its foundation built partially with timbers salvaged from the original barn, connecting past and future in a way that would have made her grandfather smile. Funded by a combination of federal research grants, university partnerships, and surprisingly, corporate restitution payments, the institute represented something revolutionary: a publicly accessible seed bank combined with an educational center dedicated to preserving agricultural biodiversity. Scientists, farmers, and students now work together to catalog, grow, and distribute the heritage varieties Joseph Westbrook had spent his life protecting. Construction crews moved efficiently across the site, completing the final phase, a climate-controlled underground vault designed to safeguard thousands of rare seed varieties against an uncertain future. Local workers nodded respectfully to Olivia as they passed, many having followed the dramatic story as it unfolded across national media. The archivist turned reluctant farmer who had exposed decades of corporate manipulation and literally fled across storm-damaged fields with irreplaceable genetic materials, while corporate security teams pursued her. "Weather forecast says we're clear for the grand opening ceremony next week," Eleanor Summers observed, her boots crunching on the frosty ground as she joined Olivia at the overlook. As the county's newly appointed Director of Agricultural Heritage, a position created specifically to address the region's recovery needs, Eleanor had become one of Olivia's closest allies in the rebuilding efforts. Her practical knowledge of local farming complemented Olivia's archival expertise, creating a partnership that bridged academic knowledge and real-world application. "My grandfather would hardly recognize the place," Olivia replied, gesturing toward what had once been traditional crop fields. The land was now organized into research plots, showcasing hundreds of heritage varieties, their careful arrangement creating a living library of agricultural diversity. "Though I think he'd approve of what it's becoming. He'd be proud," Eleanor affirmed. "Joseph always said we weren't just growing crops, but nurturing possibilities. That's exactly what's happening now." The federal investigation triggered by her grandfather's evidence had expanded far beyond initial expectations, uncovering corporate manipulation that reached into multiple government agencies. 17 Agricor executives now faced criminal charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy, with Alexandra Keller indicted on racketeering charges for orchestrating the systematic elimination of agricultural genetic diversity. Agricor itself had entered a consent decree, admitting to decades of genetic manipulation and agreeing to a historic $1.8 billion settlement that would fund biodiversity restoration and compensate farmers whose heritage varieties had been deliberately targeted for elimination. Most significantly for Olivia, the company's vast seed patent portfolio was being judicially reviewed, with many varieties reclassified as public heritage assets rather than corporate intellectual property. The most profound changes, however, weren't legal but cultural. The scandal had triggered a national conversation about food security and agricultural resilience. Heritage seeds, once dismissed as inefficient relics, were now recognized as crucial insurance against the vulnerability of genetically uniform modern agriculture. Farmers across the country were diversifying their crops. Researchers were studying forgotten varieties for climate adaptation traits, and consumers were demanding transparency about genetic narrowing in their food supply. "The governor's office called again," Eleanor mentioned as they walked back toward her county-issued truck. "They want you at the state capitol for the signing of the Agricultural Heritage Protection Act next month. Your testimony at the legislative hearings apparently changed a lot of minds." Olivia nodded absently, her thoughts still on the research center. The political attention remained uncomfortable, though she had learned to use it strategically to advance the cause of genetic preservation. "I'll be there if they agree to the expanded seed-sharing provisions. Without those protections, the whole exercise is just symbolic politics." Eleanor smiled at her directness. "I told them you'd say exactly that. They're revising the language. Now." The truck's heater blasted warm air as they pulled away from the overlook, following the winding road that had been completely blocked by debris 6 months earlier. Many of the valley's physical landmarks had been damaged in the tornado, requiring residents to create new relationships with the place they'd called home for generations, a physical manifestation of the valley's broader transformation. Familiar, reference points altered, replaced by new possibilities that required adaptation and vision. "Have you heard from Marcus recently?" Eleanor asked, navigating around a delivery vehicle bringing specialized equipment to the research center. "He's coming for Thanksgiving next week," Olivia replied, watching the familiar landscape pass by her window. "We're finding our way forward." Ooh. The storm had transformed more than the physical landscape. It had reshaped relationships as well. Olivia's former institution in Washington had offered her directorship to return, but she had declined, instead establishing the Westbrook Agricultural Archive, a specialized collection focused on documenting disappearing farming knowledge and practices. Operating from renovated rooms in the Westbrook farmhouse, her expertise was now sought nationwide by communities looking to preserve their own agricultural heritage. Marcus had initially struggled to understand her decision to remain in Shenandoah Valley, seeing it as an extended response to trauma. But as the importance of her work became clear and received national recognition, his perspective had shifted. Their relationship was evolving into something different, less defined by shared geography and more by mutual respect for each other's distinct purposes. "Howard's looking for you, by the way," Eleanor mentioned as they approached town. "Said he found something else in his father's records you should see. He seemed excited as Howard ever gets." The older generation of heritage keepers, led by Howard Garrett, had become central to the valley's recovery, their generational knowledge providing context and insight that even the most sophisticated genetic analysis couldn't capture. What had once been dismissed as old farmers' superstitions was now being documented by university researchers as traditional ecological knowledge, teak in the academic literature, with practical applications that often outperformed purely scientific approaches to agricultural resilience. Downtown Prairie River presented a stark contrast to the devastation of 6 months earlier. The main street, which had been partially damaged by the tornado, now buzzed with activity. Federal disaster funds and corporate settlement money had revitalized the small town, with damaged structures being rebuilt to enhanced resilient standards and new businesses opening to serve the influx of researchers, students, and agricultural entrepreneurs who continued to study what locals now simply called the revelation, the exposure of decades of corporate manipulation of the region's agricultural heritage. The county courthouse square featured a newly installed educational exhibit about genetic diversity, with interactive displays showing how different crop varieties responded to climate stresses. Alongside the scientific information stood a public exhibition of Joseph Westbrook's photographs documenting the valley's decades-long fight against corporate homogenization. What had once been hidden evidence in an underground room had become community education, a powerful reminder of both what had been nearly lost and what had been saved by one family's persistence. Olivia found Howard at the newly established Community Seed Library, a converted storefront where he was conducting a seed-saving workshop for local gardeners. 24 people gathered around tables covered with various plant materials, learning how to properly harvest, clean, and store seeds from their gardens, skills that had once been common knowledge but had nearly disappeared in an era of commercial seed packets. "There she is," Howard called as Olivia entered, his voice carrying across the room. "Folks, this is the archivist I was telling you about. The one who outran corporate security teams with irreplaceable heritage seeds while they chased her across tornado-damaged fields. She's the reason we're rebuilding the right way, instead of letting our agricultural heritage disappear." The participants looked at Olivia with newfound interest, a few whispers passing between them. Olivia shook her head with a smile, still uncomfortable with her reluctant celebrity status. "Mr. Garrett enjoys dramatizing things. Preservation is usually much more about careful documentation than dramatic escapes. What are you learning today?" A woman in her 40s answered confidently, "We're mapping our family's seed histories, what varieties our parents and grandparents grew, and how those seeds moved through our community over generations. Howard says understanding our food starts with understanding its story," added an elderly man, carefully labeling a small envelope of bean seeds. "He's absolutely right," Olivia affirmed, moving to examine their work. "The biggest mistake in agricultural preservation is thinking only about the physical seeds and forgetting the human knowledge that accompanies them, growing techniques, culinary uses, cultural significance. Seeds without context lose half their value." For the next half hour, Olivia worked alongside the community members, answering questions and helping them document their personal seed histories. What struck her most was their intuitive grasp of concepts that had taken her years of academic training to fully appreciate. The result of growing up in families where seed saving had been practiced, even if not fully valued, for generations. After the workshop concluded, Howard led Olivia to his office, a small room off the main seed library that the older man had converted into an informal archive of the valley's agricultural history. Family photographs covered the walls, filing. Cabinets overflowed with handwritten planting records, and hand-built display cases showcased unusual seed varieties with their stories carefully documented. "Found this in a false bottom of my father's desk drawer last week," Howard said, without preamble, carefully unfolding a large, faded document on his table. "Thought you should see it before we add it to the Institute's collection." It was a hand-drawn map dated 1934, showing the original Farm Security Administration's plant collection routes across the American countryside. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Precise line work and meticulous notations detailing hundreds of now-forgotten crop varieties and their locations. To Olivia's astonishment, the collection strategy closely resembled what she herself had proposed for the Institute's modern preservation efforts. A systematic approach that captured not just seeds, but growing knowledge, soil preferences, and climate adaptations. "They knew," Olivia murmured, leaning closer to study the detailed notations. 80 years ago, they understood biodiversity preservation principles we're only now rediscovering. Howard nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. "And they were overruled by political pressure and commercial interests, just like your grandfather was decades later. The difference is this time, the evidence couldn't be buried." The older man pointed to signatures at the bottom of the document. "Look at the names. Thomas Westbrook, your great-grandfather, Samuel Garrett, my grandfather. They weren't just farmers. They were trained by some of the best agricultural scientists of their generation during the FSA projects. When commercial hybrid seed companies took over the agricultural system after World War II, these diversity preservation plans were shelved in favor of approaches that created more uniform, controllable products and specialized chemical needs. Your grandfather picked up this work and carried it forward, knowing he'd probably face the same resistance." Later that afternoon, Olivia attended a community planning meeting at the town hall where agricultural researchers and local farmers discussed the next phases of heritage crop reintroduction. The room was packed with residents whose livelihoods had been impacted by the AgriCorps scandal, many now transitioning back to more diverse farming approaches after years of corporate dependency. As the technical advisor between research institutions and Valley residents, Olivia had the challenging task of translating complex genetic concepts into practical implications for people's lives, explaining why certain heritage varieties would thrive in specific microclimates, why diversity reduced pest pressure without chemicals, and how the new approach would protect everyone's food security better in the long run. The Native American Three Sisters planting system isn't just historical curiosity, she explained, indicating an area on the projected map that encompassed several test fields. For the farmers within this zone, interplanting corn, beans and squash using these specific heritage varieties delivers natural fertility without synthetic inputs, while providing natural pest control and maximum nutritional yield per acre. A middle-aged farmer raised his hand, skepticism evident in his expression. "That's my grandfather's approach you're talking about. Been using chemical monoculture for 30 years. You're saying we should go backwards?" Olivia met the man's gaze directly, recognizing David Thompson, whose family had farmed adjacent to the Westbrook property for generations. "I'm saying sometimes moving forward requires reclaiming wisdom we abandoned too quickly, David. These approaches were developed over thousands of years of agricultural experience. When we replaced them with chemical systems developed over mere decades, we lost resilience that can't be manufactured in laboratories. She zoomed the map out to show the entire valley. Everyone in this community makes a choice. We either work with genetic diversity that's evolved over millennia, or we gamble our food security on corporate products engineered primarily for profit. My grandfather spent 40 years documenting what happens when we choose the latter approach. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Then, surprisingly, Thompson nodded. My grandfather used to talk about how we never had resistant pests before we switched to the commercial hybrids. Said the old varieties weren't as pretty or uniform, but they didn't need nearly as many sprays. What kind of support are we looking at for this transition? That question opened a detailed discussion of the practical aspects of heritage agriculture, how federal funding, corporate settlement money, and new university partnerships would help farmers adapt to more diverse growing methods while maintaining viable businesses. The conversation happening in this room was being echoed throughout the country. A fundamental reassessment of how humans related to agricultural biodiversity in an increasingly unstable climate. The AgriCore scandal had swept away not just corporate executives and regulatory officials, but assumptions and practices that had proven dangerously unsustainable. The exposed evidence had created space for questions that had long been suppressed, about the true cost of convenience, the value of agricultural heritage, and the danger of entrusting food security to systems optimized for profit rather than resilience. As evening fell, the meeting concluded with tentative agreement on the next phase of heritage reintroduction plans. People lingered afterward, breaking into smaller conversations about specific concerns or opportunities. Olivia found herself surrounded by farmers with questions, suggestions, and occasionally simply words of gratitude for her role in exposing the truth about what had happened to their community. An elderly woman took her hand between weathered palms. My family lost our farm to AgriCore 15 years ago. They said our methods were outdated, our seeds inefficient. Now I find out they deliberately targeted us because we were preserving varieties they wanted eliminated. But you've given us something back that matters more than land. You've validated the knowledge my parents and grandparents tried to preserve. Such moments still caught Olivia off guard, the personal impact of what had begun as a professional assessment of historical preservation, the human dimensions of genetic diversity she had once studied primarily in academic terms. Later that night, as Olivia returned to the Westbrook farmhouse, now partially converted into offices for the Heritage Seed Institute, she found an unexpected package waiting at her door. A delivery from Washington, D.C. Inside was a framed photograph she had never seen before. Her grandfather Joseph, as a young man, standing proudly beside his father Thomas, in front of a Farm Security Administration vehicle, both men holding what appeared to be collection ledgers for seed gathering expeditions. A note explained that a museum curator had identified the Westbrooks in their archives and thought Olivia might want the image for the Institute's collection. Olivia placed the photo on her desk beside the architectural renderings for the underground seed vault and her grandfather's research journal, one of the few items she'd managed to save before AgriCore's security team had attempted to confiscate the underground room's contents. The contrast between what had been nearly lost and what was now being created struck her powerfully. Her inheritance had never really been the farm itself, but the values, knowledge, and purpose her family had preserved across generations. The black SUVs that had arrived that morning after the tornado had sought to silence a truth, never suspecting they would instead catalyze its expansion beyond anything a single underground room could contain. Her phone chimed with an email notification from Professor Matthews at the Smithsonian. Congressional committee approved full funding for the National Heritage Seed Network. Your testimony was the decisive factor. This project will serve as the national template going forward. Congratulations. The implications were significant. What had begun as one farmer's documentation of corporate abuse had evolved into a federally backed reimagining of how communities could protect agricultural biodiversity in an era of climate uncertainty. The Westbrook family legacy would now extend far beyond the boundaries of their Virginia farm, potentially influencing agricultural policy across the country. As autumn winds rustled dying leaves outside her window, Olivia opened her grandfather's journal, now her journal, and made her nightly entry documenting seed viability tests, germination rates, and observed climate adaptations in the heritage varieties now growing in the Institute's research fields. This record-keeping practice, which had once seemed like her grandfather's obsession, had become Olivia's own ritual, a way of seeing patterns emerge over time that might otherwise be missed. On the journal's inside cover, Olivia had carefully taped her grandfather's original letter, its words now faded, but their meaning clearer than ever. What you'll find will change your understanding of this land and possibly your path forward. Joseph Westbrook couldn't have known exactly how prophetic those words would prove, that his granddaughter would lose a barn but discover something far more valuable. The historic structure was gone, destroyed by the very storm its owner had anticipated, but its purpose had expanded beyond anything a single building could contain. A knock at her door interrupted Olivia's writing. She opened it to find Howard standing there, autumn leaves caught in his hat and a folder tucked under his arm. "Sorry to bother you so late, but I thought you'd want to see this right away," he said, stepping inside and unfolding a genetic analysis report on her table. The university lab just completed DNA sequencing on those drought-resistant wheat strains from your grandfather's collection. Look at what they found in the genetic markers. The report showed striking adaptations, genes, for root development, water retention, and soil microbiome interaction that were absent in modern commercial wheat. These heritage varieties contain drought tolerance mechanisms we've been trying to engineer for decades, Howard noted, pointing to specific sections. The natural genetic diversity was there all along, waiting to be rediscovered. Olivia studied the report, seeing confirmation of what the older keepers had maintained for years, that the agricultural heritage they preserved contained solutions to problems modern science was still struggling to address. What corporate scientists saw as inefficient genetic noise to be eliminated often contained precisely the resilience factors needed for an uncertain climate future. We should incorporate these varieties into next spring's community distribution program, she decided. Let's get these seeds back into as many hands as possible, especially in drought-prone regions. Howard nodded in agreement. That's exactly what your grandfather would have done. Let the seeds speak for themselves through their performance in real fields, not just laboratory data. After he left, Olivia returned to the window, watching stars emerge above the valley. The research center's lights created pools of illumination. Against the November darkness, researchers working late to document the day's discoveries, signs of a community reinventing its relationship with agricultural heritage even as it moved toward an uncertain future. Her phone rang, Marcus calling from Washington. "Just confirming my train time for next week," he said, his voice carrying the warmth that had been returning to their conversations in recent months. Also, that journalist from National Geographic called again about the feature story. "She wants to visit the Institute while I'm there, if that's okay with you." "That's fine," Olivia replied. Though media attention still made her uncomfortable, she had come to recognize its value in advancing the cause of agricultural biodiversity. The seed vault will be finished by then. It's quite photogenic, because people connect with images and stories, not just scientific data. Marcus pointed out, echoing what he'd told her in his professional capacity as a museum curator. The genetic diversity is crucial, but what resonates is your family's story, the archivist who discovered her true heritage was growing in the fields, not just preserved in documents. It's a narrative people need right now. Olivia accepted his perspective, recognizing how personal stories could illuminate larger truths. National Geographic can come, but make sure they understand this isn't about one family or one farm. It's about reclaiming a relationship with our food that we nearly lost completely. After ending the call, Olivia sat at her desk and completed her journal entry, adding notes about the wheat genetics Howard had shared. Tomorrow would bring meetings about spring planting selections, educational programs for local schools, and continued work on the International Seed Exchange Network. The heritage preservation work had become her life's purpose, not the obligation she had initially resented, but a calling she had discovered beneath the tornado-scattered timbers of her grandfather's barn. As she prepared for bed, Olivia paused before the photograph of her grandfather and great-grandfather, seeing in their expressions the same quiet determination she now recognized in herself. Joseph Westbrook had faced the same powerful interests, the same critical decisions about genetic diversity, the same struggle to protect agricultural heritage that often wasn't valued until it was nearly lost. "I understand now, Grandpa," Olivia said softly to the image. It was never just about the farm. The black SUVs that had arrived at Olivia's farm that fateful morning had sought to contain a truth, never suspecting they were instead releasing it beyond any possibility of suppression. They had come offering millions for her silence, only to catalyze changes worth billions to the nation's agricultural future. Sometimes, Olivia reflected, as she watched autumn leaves swirl in the night. Wind, you have to lose something precious to find what's truly irreplaceable. Her grandfather had understood this truth and prepared for it, creating a path Olivia couldn't see until the storm rose and stripped away all distractions. The tornado had destroyed Westbrook Farm's historic barn, but in doing so had revealed foundations much deeper than any building, a legacy of knowledge, responsibility, and connection to agricultural heritage that no storm could sweep away. As the valley slept beneath its blanket of autumn frost, Olivia Westbrook closed her grandfather's journal, now her journal, and prepared for another day of rebuilding not just what had been lost, but what had always been possible. The underground room her grandfather had hidden beneath the barn was now replicated 1,000 times over, in community seed libraries, university collections, and most importantly, in fields where heritage varieties once again grew under open skies. There, genetic diversity, a living insurance policy against an uncertain future. What had begun as a reluctant obligation to fulfill her grandfather's will had transformed into something far more meaningful, a mission to ensure that agricultural heritage, preserved by generations of dedicated keepers, would continue to nourish not just the body, but the human connection to the earth itself. The storm had destroyed a barn and exposed a hidden room, but the true revelation had been the discovery of purpose, a calling that connected Olivia to both her family's past and humanity's future in ways no career in Washington ever could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.